Derek Hayes had spent a decade running, trying to outpace the ghosts of his past. 10 years since that disastrous mission in Kandahar. 10 years haunted by the memory of innocent blood staining his hands, irrevocably shattering his soul. He'd buried his Delta Force training deep, trading in his combat boots for the humble tools of a carpenter, vowing to himself that he would never inflict harm on another living soul. His daughter, Chloe, was everything to him now. Pancakes on Saturday mornings, diligently helping her with her homework, reading her bedtime stories in a gentle voice. His life was simple, safe, and, most importantly, clean. Then, like a lightning strike, Harper Sterling burst through his front door at precisely 8:00 p.m. on a rainy October night. The 7-year-old's face was a canvas streaked with tears and blood, her small voice breaking, cracking with each terrified scream, as she uttered the words that would shatter his carefully constructed peaceful existence. "They beat my mom. She's dying." Her mother, Rachel, a powerful and influential CEO, was in the throes of being brutally murdered by her own husband and his hired thugs, just a few short miles away. The local police force had been bought and paid for. Help simply wasn't coming. Harper's desperate, pleading eyes held only one question, a question that cut straight to Derek's core. Would he save her? Derek stared down at his hands, examining them. Carpenter's hands, calloused and worn. Father's hands, gentle and loving. Killer's hands, stained with the indelible marks of war. He had a mere 12 hours. This time, he swore, he would get it right. The sunlight of a new Saturday morning streamed through the kitchen window of their small apartment, illuminating swirling dust motes dancing in its golden rays. Derek Hayes stood at the stove, spatula in hand, carefully watching pancakes bubble and brown in the seasoned cast-iron skillet. The comforting scent of melting butter and sweet vanilla filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of fresh coffee brewing on the counter. Outside, the city was slowly beginning to stir and wake. The distant, almost imperceptible hum of traffic served as a gentle reminder that the world continued its relentless rotation, indifferent to the small, precious moments of peace they carved out within the confines of those walls. Chloe sat patiently at the kitchen table, her 8-year-old legs swinging back and forth beneath the chair, not quite long enough to reach the floor. She was engrossed in colouring in a book, her tongue poking out ever so slightly in intense concentration as she meticulously selected a vibrant purple crayon for what appeared to be a magnificent dragon's scales. Her dark hair, still charmingly messy from sleep, caught the soft morning light in such a way that Derek felt his chest tighten with a familiar ache, a bittersweet pang of emotion. She looked so much like Rebecca had, before the devastating complications during childbirth had cruelly taken her away, leaving him utterly alone with a fragile newborn and a grief so profound and all-consuming that it had nearly swallowed him whole. He flipped the pancakes with practiced ease, years of ingrained muscle memory guiding his movements with effortless precision. Cooking had become his form of meditation, a simple, grounding ritual. The act of creating something warm and nourishing was a way to anchor himself firmly in the present moment, to keep the ever-present ghosts of his past securely at bay. The scar tissue on his back pulled slightly as he reached for the bottle of maple syrup. A complex network of old wounds lay hidden beneath his worn and comfortable flannel shirt, a road map of battles fought and survived. Some mornings he forgot they were even there, lost in the rhythm of his new life. Other mornings, however, they throbbed with a persistent phantom pain, cruelly reminding him of the things he'd rather forget, the things that haunted his dreams. "Daddy, can Harper come over today?" Chloe's voice cut through his thoughts, bright and full of the innocent hope that only children seem to possess so early in the morning. Derek deftly plated the pancakes, adding a small pat of butter that immediately began to melt into golden rivulets. "Maybe, sweetheart. We'll see if her mum says it's okay." He carefully set the plate in front of her, instantly noticing how her face lit up with pure joy at the sight of her breakfast. Simple joys. That was what he had painstakingly built his life around now. Simple joys that demanded no violence, no agonizing split-second decisions about who lived and who died. Harper Sterling had started appearing at their humble apartment about 6 months prior. She was a quiet, unusually well-behaved girl with piercingly serious dark eyes. She never asked for snacks, always remembered to say please and thank you, and seemed genuinely grateful simply to be in their small, cozy space. Chloe had declared them to be best friends within a week, and Derek simply hadn't had the heart to question the intensity or the suddenness of their bond. Kids needed friends. He understood loneliness far better than most, but he'd noticed things, subtle, almost imperceptible things. The way Harper flinched at loud noises, the small, fading bruise on her forearm he'd spotted 3 weeks ago, finger-shaped and yellowing. The way she sometimes stared off into space, her expression far too knowing, far too old for a 7-year-old face. When he'd tentatively asked Chloe about Harper's family, she'd said her friend's mum was really pretty, but always seemed sad, and her stepfather was mean and yelled a lot. Derek had dutifully filed the information away, a primal instinct prickling uncomfortably at the base of his skull, but he had deliberately done nothing. It wasn't his business. He didn't get involved anymore. That was the sacred deal he'd made with himself 10 long years ago, a vow whispered in the face of unimaginable horror. He poured himself a cup of strong coffee and sat down across from Chloe, watching her gleefully drown her pancakes in syrup with the unrestrained enthusiasm that only a child could genuinely muster. The apartment was small, a modest 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a living room barely large enough to comfortably fit a couch and a television, but it was theirs. The rent was affordable. The neighbors mostly minded their own business, and the local elementary school was conveniently located only 3 blocks away. After everything he'd been through, after the medals and the highly classified missions and the crushing weight of choices that had ultimately broken him, this simple, quiet life felt like a form of absolution, or at least it had. His phone vibrated loudly on the counter, jarring him from his thoughts. A text message from Mrs. Patterson next door, politely asking if he could take a look at her bathroom cabinet this afternoon, as it was sticking badly. He quickly typed back an affirmative response. Carpentry had become his trade, a practical skill he'd painstakingly picked up during those long, soul-searching years of desperately trying to build something instead of destroying it. His hands, once expertly trained to disassemble weapons in pitch darkness and execute perfect, silent takedowns, now measured wood and drove screws with the same unnerving precision. The irony of it all certainly wasn't lost on him. Chloe finished her breakfast and dutifully carried her plate to the sink without even being asked, standing on her tiptoes to rinse it carefully under the faucet. She'd grown so much in the past year, shooting up like a weed, her features gradually sharpening from baby softness into the distinct person she was rapidly becoming. Derek felt the familiar twist of both pride and overwhelming terror that came with being a single father, a constant, low-level anxiety that never truly left him. Every single day he was terrified that he would somehow mess her up, that his own deeply ingrained damage would seep into her like a slow-acting poison. But every day she proved to be stronger, kinder, and far more whole than he had ever been, a testament to her resilience and unwavering spirit. "Can we go to the park later?" she asked, turning to him with wet hands and that perpetually hopeful expression that made it almost impossible for him to say no. "Sure thing, kiddo. Let me finish up Mrs. Patterson's cabinet first, then we'll head over there." He stood up, ruffling her hair affectionately as he passed by. Through the window he could see the neighborhood stretching out below, a tapestry of modest homes, chain-link fences, and cars that had undoubtedly seen better days. A few miles to the east, the city skyline rose sharply and glittered in the sun, a display of almost ostentatious wealth. Towers of gleaming glass and steel, where people like Rachel Sterling lived their lives in sprawling penthouses and corner offices far removed from his own humble existence. Two vastly different worlds, separated not only by geography but by wealth and privilege, rarely intersecting. He preferred it that way, honestly. The view from up there came with far too many complications, too many prying eyes watching your every move, too many unrealistic expectations. His reflection caught in the window glass for a fleeting moment. A man in his early 40s, still relatively fit, but undeniably carrying the heavy weight of years etched into the set of his shoulders, his dark hair now threaded with noticeable streaks of grey at the temples, his eyes holding the haunted look of someone who had simply seen too much. He quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the image staring back at him. Some mornings he barely recognized the person staring back at him from the mirror. The man he had been in the service, the highly skilled operator who had moved silently through war zones like a ghost, felt like a completely different life entirely, a life he had deliberately buried deep, along with the echoing screams that still occasionally surfaced in his nightmares. The rest of the morning passed in a comfortable, well-worn routine. He fixed Mrs. Patterson's troublesome cabinet while Chloe played quietly in their apartment, the old woman chattering incessantly about her grandson's upcoming wedding as he worked diligently. His hands moved almost automatically, effortlessly, tightening screws and adjusting hinges, his mind only half present in the task at hand. The other half, as always, remained hyper-alert, meticulously cataloguing sounds, potential exits, and possible threats. Old habits died hard, ingrained deeply into his psyche. Even after 10 years of deliberate civilian life, some primal part of him was always on watch, always ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. He absolutely hated that part of himself, the part he couldn't seem to shake. It made him feel like a loaded weapon that someone had carelessly forgotten to disarm. By early afternoon, they finally made it to the park. Chloe ran straight for the swings, her infectious laughter carrying on the crisp autumn breeze. Derek sat down heavily on a nearby bench, shoving his hands deep into his jacket pockets, watching her pump her legs with all her might to gain height, soaring through the air with unadulterated joy. Other parents dotted the playground, completely absorbed in their phones or engaged in casual conversations, and he felt the familiar sense of distance that always existed between him and so-called normal people. They worried about soccer practice and homework assignments. He worried about the permanent scar tissue in his lungs from a long-ago gas exposure incident, about the way his right hand sometimes trembled uncontrollably when he tried to hold a pen, about the therapy appointments he kept cancelling because he knew that endlessly talking about it never actually made it any better, never truly erased the memories. The afternoon slowly faded into evening. Dinner was simple but comforting: grilled cheese sandwiches and creamy tomato soup, Chloe's absolute favourite. They ate together at the small kitchen table, and she excitedly told him all about a captivating book she was currently reading in school, something about a young girl who unexpectedly discovered magic. He listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and genuinely tried to be present in the moment, actively trying not to think about the calendar date, about the grim fact that it was exactly 10 years and 4 months since that ill-fated mission in Kandahar, since the faulty intel had led them astray, since the building they had meticulously cleared had tragically contained not insurgents, but a family celebrating a wedding. 10 years and 4 months since he had quietly put in his discharge papers and walked away from everything he had ever known, desperately seeking a new path. Bath time, a calming bedtime story. Carefully tucking her into bed with the comforting glow of her nightlight on, because she was still, understandably, afraid of complete darkness. These carefully crafted rituals anchored him, giving structure and meaning to days that might otherwise slip away unnoticed into nothingness. As he gently pulled her bedroom door almost closed, leaving it open just a crack the way she preferred, he cautiously allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that this was enough. That genuine peace could actually be found in simple pleasures like pancakes and park visits, and in the small, trusting hand that so faithfully held his. It was precisely 8:07 p.m. when the frantic pounding started on his door. Not a polite knock, but a violent pounding, desperate and frantic, the kind of jarring sound that sent a surge of adrenaline spiking through his entire system before his conscious mind had even fully processed it. Derek was already on his feet and moving before he had consciously made the decision to stand, his body reacting instinctively, responding to years of rigorous training, muscle memory powerfully overriding the decade of deliberate softness he had painstakingly cultivated. His hand reached automatically for his waistband where a weapon would have been, finding nothing but empty fabric. Right. He didn't carry any more. He hadn't even touched a gun in 10 long years. The pounding came again, even harder this time, accompanied by a small, terrified voice crying out, "Please, please open up, Mr. Hayes!" He immediately recognized the voice. Harper. Derek yanked the door open, and the small girl practically fell into the apartment, completely soaked to the skin despite the clear evening sky. Her hair was plastered tightly to her skull. Blood trickled down from a scrape on her knee, mixing with what looked like a combination of rain and tears. Her eyes were wide and wild, her pupils blown wide with abject terror, and she was shaking so violently that her teeth visibly chattered. For one frozen moment, Derek could only stare in stunned silence, his brain struggling to reconcile the polite, quiet child he knew with this trembling, terrified creature who stood before him. "Harper! What?" he started, but she grabbed his shirt with both hands, her small fingers clutching the fabric with desperate strength. "They're killing her!" The words burst out of her in a strangled, almost inhuman scream. "My mum, they're hurting her, and she's not moving, and there's so much blood." Her voice cracked completely, dissolving into uncontrollable sobs. "Please, you have to help her. She's dying." The entire apartment seemed to tilt precariously. Derek's hands moved automatically, steadily, supporting the child, his mind already racing through countless possibilities, rapidly assessing the situation, formulating a plan. Who's hurting her? Where? Vincent, my stepfather. He's got men with him. And they were hitting her, and she fell down. Harper gasped for air, her whole small body convulsing with the sheer effort to breathe through her overwhelming panic. I ran. I climbed out my window, and I ran, and I didn't know where else to go. And you have to help her. Please, please. Behind him, Chloe's bedroom door creaked open. His daughter stood there in her pajamas, her eyes wide with concern, taking in the chaotic scene unfolding before her. Derek held up a hand to her, a silent but firm command to stay back, and she immediately froze in place. Good girl. She understood the gravity of the situation when he used that particular tone, even though he almost never did. He gently guided Harper to the couch, his mind working through the complex logistics of the situation with the same cold, detached efficiency that he had never quite managed to completely kill off. Harper, listen to me. I need you to focus. How long ago did this happen? I don't know. Maybe 30 minutes. I ran as fast as I could, but it's far. Another sob choked her words, rendering her almost incoherent. 30 minutes. Jesus, if the beating had been severe enough to send a terrified 7-year-old running through the city alone in the dark, 30 minutes might as well be an eternity. Derek quickly pulled out his cell phone, dialing 911 with fingers that wanted to shake uncontrollably, but didn't, thanks to years of deeply ingrained discipline. The operator answered on the second ring, professionally calm and reassuring, and he began to report a domestic violence situation in progress. No! Harper lunged forward, grabbing his wrist with surprising force for someone so small. They won't help. Vincent paid them. I heard him say it on the phone last week. He said he owned half the cops in this district, and they'd never... Her voice broke completely again. They won't come. Or if they do, they'll just leave. Please, you have to. Derek's jaw tightened visibly. Corruption. Of course, a man with enough money and powerful connections could easily buy a lot of silence, a lot of carefully turned backs. He'd certainly seen it before in other countries, in other contexts. The operator was still talking in his ear, calmly asking questions, and he carefully explained the increasingly dire situation, possible domestic violence, child witness, address needed. He gave Harper's address as she rattled it off between sobs, and the operator assured him that units would be dispatched immediately. He ended the call, but he didn't believe for a single second that help would arrive in time, or that it would arrive at all. Harper's desperate eyes bored into his, dark and knowing, far too knowing for her young age. She'd already seen enough to understand that the world didn't always work the way it was supposed to, that money and power often trumped justice, and that sometimes the cavalry simply wasn't coming. Mr. Hayes, please. She was practically begging now, and something deep in his chest cracked irrevocably at the sound of it, a sound that echoed the shattering of his own carefully constructed peace. My mum is going to die. I know she is. I saw. There was so much blood, and she wasn't moving. And Vincent, he was laughing. Her small body shook violently with the force of emotions that were simply too large for her to contain. She's all I have. Please. Please. Derek stood there, this broken little girl clinging to him desperately, and he felt the very foundations of his carefully constructed, peaceful life begin to crumble beneath his feet, disintegrating into dust. He had sworn a solemn vow 10 long years ago, standing in a desolate cemetery beneath the cold, indifferent Afghan stars, surrounded by the freshly dug graves of people who had tragically died because of his actions. Never again would he blindly trust the intel, the mission, the righteous certainty that violence could ever truly solve anything. Never again would he allow his highly honed skills to be used to destroy, to inflict such pain and suffering. But this wasn't a mission. This was a child, terrified and desperate, pleading with him to save her mother from certain death. Chloe moved closer, her small hand gently finding his, silently seeking reassurance. "Daddy?" Her voice was tiny and uncertain. She'd never seen him like this before, poised precariously on the edge of a momentous decision that would irrevocably change everything. "Can you help Harper's mom?" He looked down at his daughter, his whole world, the very reason he got up every morning and stubbornly pushed through the recurring nightmares and the crushing guilt and the crippling weight of the past. If something happened to him, she would be completely alone, Mrs. Patterson was undoubtedly kind, but she was 76 years old and had absolutely no legal claim on Chloe. Chloe would almost certainly end up in the dreaded system, bounced relentlessly between impersonal foster homes, her fragile childhood carved up and distributed to complete strangers. But if he did absolutely nothing, Harper would have to live with the agonizing knowledge that her mother had died while she had begged for help and been coldly turned away. He knew exactly what that kind of soul-crushing guilt did to a person, how it relentlessly burrowed into your soul and made a permanent home there, whispering insidious poison in the quietest hours of the night. Harper would carry that unbearable burden forever, just as he carried Kandahar, a weight that threatened to pull him under. The choice, when he truly examined it, wasn't really a choice at all. "Chloe, get your shoes on. You're going to Mrs. Patterson's." His voice came out steady and calm, the same unwavering tone he had always used to brief his teams before dangerous insertions. Chloe blinked in momentary confusion, but quickly nodded, years of implicitly trusting him overriding her natural apprehension. She disappeared into her bedroom without another word. Derek knelt down in front of Harper, meeting her tear-filled eyes. "I'm going to help your mum, but I need you to stay here with my daughter and Mrs. Patterson. Can you do that?" Harper nodded frantically, relief visibly flooding her face, even as fresh tears continued to stream uncontrollably down her cheeks. "Thank you. Thank you. Oh, God, thank you." He squeezed her shoulder gently in a comforting gesture, then stood up and moved with renewed purpose toward his own bedroom. In the very back of his closet, hidden behind stacks of old, forgotten tools and neatly folded winter clothes, was a locked case he hadn't opened in a decade, a relic of a past he had tried so hard to escape. His hands, however, instinctively remembered the intricate combination, even as his mind desperately tried to reject what he was about to do. The case clicked open with a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Inside lay a knife, a wickedly sharp tactical blade, 7 inches of blackened steel with a grip worn smooth from years of constant use. Next to it, a pair of thin black gloves. That was it. He'd gotten rid of everything else. The guns, the specialized gear, the military uniforms, All of it had been either sold, systematically destroyed, or quietly given away. But he'd kept these two small items, some small defiant part of him, stubbornly unable to completely sever the connection to the man he had once been. Now, looking down at them, he felt a cold, unsettling clarity settle over him, a stark and brutal understanding. This was who he truly was, deep down. Not a simple carpenter, not a peaceful single dad making pancakes on Saturday mornings. Those things were undoubtedly true, but they weren't the whole, unvarnished truth. Beneath the carefully constructed facade, he was still, at his very core, a highly trained operator, still a deadly weapon that instinctively knew exactly how to be wielded. He tucked the knife securely into his waistband, pulled on the gloves, and grabbed a dark, nondescript jacket. When he emerged from the bedroom, Chloe was already ready, dressed and waiting patiently, and Harper was visibly trying to compose herself, struggling to regain some semblance of control. He herded both girls next door, quickly explaining to a very confused Mrs. Patterson that there was an emergency and he would be back as soon as humanly possible, pointedly ignoring her barrage of concerned questions. There simply wasn't enough time to explain, not nearly enough time. Back inside his own apartment, Derek stood in the very center of his small living room and deliberately allowed himself to fully feel it, the subtle but profound shift, the undeniable transformation, the shedding of the carefully constructed persona he had worn so diligently for the past 10 years. His breathing slowed noticeably, deepened, and his senses instantly sharpened. The apartment came into an almost unnerving hyper-focus, every single detail etched with crystal clarity, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of sirens, the lingering smell of dish soap from dinner, his own heartbeat steady and slow, the rhythmic cadence he had trained into himself during countless hours of meticulous preparation for moments exactly like this one. He hadn't wanted this, had spent the last 10 years desperately running from it, trying to outrun his own nature. But Harper's face, streaked with tears and utter terror, had ultimately made the agonizing decision for him. Some things, he realized, were undeniably worth breaking solemn vows for. Some things simply demanded action, regardless of the potential cost. Derek grabbed his keys and walked purposefully out the door, pulling it shut behind him with a quiet, almost imperceptible click. The hallway suddenly felt different, charged with a palpable tension. Shadows seemed deeper, sounds became sharper and more distinct. He was already tactical, already meticulously assessing every single detail, already formulating a plan. The drive to the address Harper had given him would take approximately 20 minutes, maybe less if he pushed it a little. He'd have to find a way in without triggering any security systems, quickly locate Rachel Sterling, meticulously assess her current condition, and somehow extract her from whatever horrific situation was currently unfolding. All while simultaneously dealing with Vincent Russo and however many men he had with him. The old Derek, the seasoned operator, would have undoubtedly found this situation exhilarating, a complex challenge, a dangerous puzzle to be solved with precise violence and ruthless efficiency. This Derek the father just felt overwhelmingly tired and utterly scared, but also grimly determined. He wasn't doing this for the thrill of it, not anymore. He was doing it because a terrified little girl had knocked desperately on his door and begged him to save her mother, and he simply couldn't live with himself if he turned her away, condemning her to a lifetime of guilt and regret. His old truck was parked on the street, a beat-up Ford pickup with numerous rust spots and a notoriously temperamental starter. It coughed unreliably to life on the second try, and he pulled out cautiously into traffic, heading swiftly toward the wealthy district on the east side of the city. The city slid past his windows, neon signs and blurry streetlights merging together in a dizzying kaleidoscope of colors, and Derek deliberately let his mind go completely quiet, focusing only on the task ahead. No more doubts, no more agonizing second-guessing. He'd made his choice, and he had to own it. Now he just had to see it through to the bitter end and desperately pray that this time, this one crucial time, he could actually get it right. The mansion district rose before him like a completely different world, a world he had only glimpsed from afar. Gated communities, meticulously manicured lawns stretching out into the darkness. Houses that could easily swallow his entire humble apartment building twice over. He found the Sterling residence easily enough, a modern architectural masterpiece constructed of glass and steel, bathed in a cold internal light, undeniably beautiful but undeniably cold and sterile. A monument to material success and all the inherent emptiness that so often came along with it. Derek parked his truck 3 blocks away and approached the property on foot, sticking carefully to the shadows, utilizing his years of experience to remain unseen. The rain that had soaked Harper had finally stopped, leaving the streets wet and glistening eerily under the diffused streetlights. He moved with the fluid silence of someone who had spent countless years practicing how to be completely invisible, how to slip effortlessly through spaces without disturbing even the slightest movement of air. It felt strangely wrong and undeniably right at the exact same time. His body instinctively remembering rhythms his conscious mind had tried so hard to forget. The property had a formidable security fence, 8 feet of wrought iron with menacing decorative spikes on top, and strategically placed security cameras at each corner, sweeping back and forth in slow, methodical arcs. He carefully timed their rotation, waited patiently for the precise gap in their coverage, and smoothly went over the fence in one fluid motion, landing silently on the dew-covered grass on the other side. His shoulder twinged sharply in protest, an old injury that had never quite healed correctly, but he stubbornly pushed through it. Pain was simply information, nothing more. 2 men stood casually near the front entrance, both dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits that screamed private security. They were talking quietly, not particularly alert. Sloppy. Derek filed that crucial piece of information away for future use and silently circled toward the back of the expansive house, where a sprawling patio and numerous floor-to-ceiling windows offered multiple potential entry points. He could discern slight movement inside, fleeting shadows crossing and recrossing. How many men were inside? 3, maybe 4. It was hard to tell definitively from his current vantage point. A door leading off the patio hung slightly ajar, spilling a warm, inviting golden light out into the surrounding darkness. Careless or intentional. Maybe they'd used it to drag Rachel outside at some point, or maybe one of them had briefly stepped out for a cigarette. Either way, it was undoubtedly his way in. Derek stealthily crossed the patio in a low crouch, his boots making absolutely no sound on the expensive stone. He pressed himself tightly against the wall beside the partially open door, listening intently. He could hear voices inside, undoubtedly male, and surprisingly casual, along with the distinct clinking of ice in glasses. Someone even laughed, a chillingly mundane sound coming from people who had just committed a violent act and seemingly felt no remorse whatsoever about it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He silently slipped through the door into what appeared to be a massive, impeccably designed kitchen. Marble countertops, state-of-the-art professional-grade appliances, everything gleaming and pristine, but completely empty. The voices were clearly coming from somewhere deeper within the expansive house, emanating from beyond an arched doorway. Derek moved cautiously toward it, his hand instinctively resting on the knife at his waistband, and deliberately allowed himself one last, fleeting moment of quiet hesitation. Once he stepped through that doorway, there would be absolutely no going back. He'd be fully committed. The peaceful life he had so painstakingly built would almost certainly be over, even if he somehow managed to survive this. But Harper's desperate voice echoed hauntingly in his mind. "Please. She's all I have." Derek took a deep breath, steeled his resolve, and stepped boldly through the doorway and directly into the escalating war he had been trying so desperately to escape for the past 10 years. The hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit by recessed fixtures that cast unsettling pools of shadow between islands of light. Expensive art lined the walls, abstract pieces that probably cost more than his aging truck. His footsteps were completely silent on the polished hardwood floor, years of ingrained training making him little more than a whisper in the wind, more than just a whisper of displaced air. The voices were getting louder as he ventured deeper into the house, and now he could clearly distinguish words. "Should have kept her damn mouth shut." A deep, satisfied male voice echoed. "Stupid bitch thought she could threaten me." "Me?" Another, lighter laugh followed. "She actually believed the board would side with her over you, boss. That's a riot." Derek's hands clenched into fists, but he consciously forced them to relax. Emotion was the ultimate enemy in situations like this. Anger made you sloppy, caused you to rush, and made you forget to check your corners. He needed to be as cold as ice, not burning with fire. The hallway opened into a spacious living room. He pressed himself flat against the wall, cautiously peering around the corner. He saw 3 men. One was sprawled out on a leather couch, drink in hand, his suit jacket carelessly tossed aside. Another stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the glittering city lights. The third was leaning against a marble fireplace, idly scrolling through his phone. They all appeared relaxed, acting as if they'd just finished a normal day at the office instead of having just beaten a woman unconscious. There was no sign of Vincent Russo, no sign of Rachel either. Derek's tactical mind swiftly assessed the room. 20 feet to the nearest man. Windows behind him, offering a possible exit route if needed, but a noisy one. Marble fireplace, hard surfaces. Sound would carry easily. 3 against 1, but they were complacent, completely unprepared. He had the element of surprise, which was worth more than numbers. However, he didn't actually want to fight them. Fighting would mean noise, which would alert anyone else in the house, and waste precious time that Rachel might not have. He needed to find her first, assess her condition, and then figure out the best way to extract them both. These men were simply obstacles, not the primary targets. Derek slowly eased back from the corner and moved toward a staircase he'd spotted on the opposite side of the hallway. The master bedroom would likely be upstairs. That's probably where Harper had been sleeping when she'd witnessed whatever had transpired, and that's where Rachel would be too, if they'd just left her where she'd fallen. The stairs were carpeted, which helpfully muffled his footsteps as he ascended. His right hand hovered near the knife, ready but not yet drawn. Drawing a weapon changed the entire dynamic, turning possibility into absolute certainty. He wasn't ready for that level of commitment just yet. He wasn't quite ready to cross that final, irreversible line between the man he'd become and the man he once was. The second floor was noticeably quieter, more intimate. Family photos adorned the walls. Rachel and Harper on a beach somewhere, both beaming with happiness. Harper as a toddler, looking adorable. An older photo of Rachel with a different man, probably Harper's biological father, but no pictures of Vincent. Interesting. This was clearly Rachel's space, her personal history, and Vincent was merely an unwelcome intruder in it. A door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, with light spilling out. Derek approached it with extreme caution, his senses on high alert. He could hear someone inside. Heavy breathing, the creak of floorboards, suggesting a single person moving around. He reached the doorway and peered inside. The master bedroom was a complete disaster. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, its shade crushed. The bedding was partially ripped from the mattress, with pillows scattered haphazardly. A chair had been overturned, and in the middle of it all, Vincent Russo stood over Rachel Sterling's motionless body, casually straightening his tie. Derek's breath caught in his throat. Rachel lay crumpled on the floor near the bed, her face turned away from him, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. A pool of blood had gathered beneath her head, soaking into the cream-colored carpet. Her business suit was torn, her blouse stained a dark crimson. She wasn't moving at all. From his vantage point, Derek couldn't even tell if she was breathing. Vincent was a large man, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders, and the kind of cultivated presence that came from years of commanding attention in boardrooms. His knuckles were split and bleeding, and his expensive shirt was spattered with what was almost certainly his wife's blood. He looked down at Rachel with an expression that made Derek's stomach churn. It wasn't rage or even passion, but just cold, calculating detachment, as if he were looking at a problem he'd already solved. "Should have just signed the papers, Rachel," Vincent said conversationally, addressing the unconscious woman. "It would have been so much easier. 60-40 split. You keep the house. We both walk away clean. But no, you just had to go digging into the accounts, had to find the transfers." He crouched down, reaching out to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her face, a gesture that was somehow more obscene than any act of violence. "Now look at you. Such a waste." Derek's hand instinctively moved to the knife before he even consciously decided to act. The weight of it in his palm was familiar, almost comforting, in a way that deeply terrified him. This was it, the moment of no return. He could still turn around, call the police again, and trust the system, even though Harper had warned him that it was corrupt. He could still be the man who made pancakes, fixed cabinets, and pretended that the past was dead and buried. Then Vincent pulled a cell phone from his pocket and made a call. "Yeah, it's me. I need the cleanup crew. Same location, and make it fast. I want this done before midnight." A pause. "No, she's done. Not my problem anymore. Just make sure it looks like an accident. Maybe a home invasion gone wrong." Another pause, then a cold, mirthless laugh. "Because I'm paying you enough to make damn sure, that's why. Just get here." He ended the call and stood up, stepping over Rachel's body as if she were nothing more than discarded debris. He walked toward the ensuite bathroom, presumably to clean himself up, and Derek finally moved. 10 years of rust should have slowed him down, should have made him hesitate, second-guess himself, fumble. But the muscle memory was ingrained, etched into him by countless hours of training and dozens of real-world operations. His body knew exactly what to do, even as his mind screamed at him to stop. He crossed the room in 4 silent strides. Vincent heard something at the last possible second, some faint sound, some subtle displacement of air, and began to turn. But Derek was already upon him, one hand clamping firmly over the bigger man's mouth, the other bringing the knife up to rest lightly against his throat. Not cutting, not yet. Just a clear promise of what could happen. "Make a sound, and you die," Derek whispered, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Nod, if you understand." Vincent's eyes were wide with terror, the whites showing all around the irises. He nodded frantically. "How many men in the house?" Vincent tried to speak against Derek's palm. Derek eased the pressure slightly, still keeping the knife steady. 3 downstairs." Vincent gasped. "That's it. Just 3. Rachel Sterling. Is she alive?" I don't know. Maybe." Vincent's voice cracked, and Derek felt a wave of disgust wash over him. The man was going to play the victim now, pretend this was all just some unfortunate accident, as if he hadn't just ordered a clean-up crew to dispose of his wife's body. Derek's hand tightened involuntarily, and he could feel Vincent's pulse hammering erratically beneath his fingers. It would be so incredibly easy, one quick, precise motion, just like he'd been trained. Vincent Russo would be dead before he even hit the floor, and the world would be a slightly better place for it. One less predator, one less man who preyed on women and bought his way out of the consequences. But then he'd be that person again, the cold-blooded operator who killed with clinical efficiency, the weapon who justified murder as justice, the man he'd sworn never to become again. The knife trembled slightly in his hand. "Please," Vincent whimpered. "Please, I've got money. Whatever you want. I can pay." Derek shoved him away with enough force to send him stumbling backward. Vincent caught himself on the bathroom doorframe, spinning around, and Derek saw the precise moment when calculation replaced fear in the man's eyes. He was assessing the situation, measuring the odds, trying to decide if he could take Derek in a fight. "Don't," Derek said quietly. "You'll lose." Something in his tone must have conveyed the absolute truth of that statement, because Vincent stayed exactly where he was. His gaze flicked to Rachel's body, then to the door, then back to Derek. "Who are you? Some kind of cop? Someone who's going to make sure you don't hurt anyone else tonight?" Derek moved to Rachel, kneeling beside her while still keeping Vincent in his peripheral vision. His fingers found her neck, pressed against the bloodied carpet. For one terrifying moment, there was nothing. Then, faint and thready, but undeniably there, a pulse. Relief flooded through him with such intensity that it made his hands shake uncontrollably. She was alive, barely, but alive. "She's breathing," Derek said, more to himself than to Vincent. Blood matted her hair, and her face was already a mess of darkening bruises. Broken nose, likely a skull fracture, possible internal injuries. She needed to get to a hospital immediately, but the cleanup crew was on their way. 3 men were waiting downstairs, and Vincent was still standing there, watching him with eyes that had moved past fear and into something colder and far more dangerous. "You're making a mistake," Vincent said, his voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. "Do you even know who I am? I have connections, police, judges, people you can't even imagine. You think you can just walk into my house and save your wife's life?" Derek cut him off. "Yeah, I think I can do that." Vincent's jaw tightened. "She's not the victim here. She was going to destroy everything I've built, ruin my reputation over some accounting discrepancies. I gave her everything. This house, her company, a lifestyle most people only dream about, and she repaid me by threatening to go to the SEC. The casual justification, the complete lack of remorse, made something snap deep inside Derek. He stood up slowly, turning to face Vincent fully, and allowed just a fraction of the barely contained violence he kept leashed to show in his eyes. "You beat your wife unconscious and called someone to make her death look like an accident. There's no version of this where you're the victim." Vincent must have seen something in Derek's face that genuinely terrified him, because he backed up a step, his hands coming up defensively. "Look, we can work this out. How much? 50, 100. I can have it wired tonight, completely untraceable." Just then, the bedroom door burst open and one of the men from downstairs charged in, probably alerted by the raised voices. He was big, well-trained, moving with the compact efficiency of someone who knew how to handle himself. His hand went for something at his waistband, gun or taser, Derek couldn't immediately tell, and there was no more time for thinking. Derek moved purely on instinct. The knife was still in his hand, and he used it not to stab but to deflect, knocking the man's arm wide as he drew his weapon. A taser sparking ominously. Derek grabbed the man's wrist, twisted hard, felt something pop, and the taser clattered uselessly to the floor. The guard swung with his other hand, a wild haymaker that would have taken Derek's head clean off if it had connected. But it didn't connect, because Derek ducked swiftly under it and drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus with precisely calculated force. The guard went down, gasping for air, and Derek was already moving past him toward the door. The other 2 would be coming now, drawn by the commotion. He needed to control the staircase, keep them bottlenecked, and prevent them from overwhelming him with their superior numbers. But his hands were shaking violently. The adrenaline that had carried him through the initial confrontation was now curdling into something uglier, something more dangerous. The old familiar rush of combat, the crystal-clear clarity that came from violence, the terrible satisfaction of solving problems with brute force. He'd forgotten how good it felt, how simple, how terribly wrong. He reached the top of the stairs just as the other 2 guards reached the bottom. They saw him and froze for a split second, probably not expecting any resistance, and certainly not expecting someone who moved the way Derek moved. That hesitation cost them dearly. Derek descended 3 steps and launched himself at the nearest one, using momentum and gravity to drive the man backward into his partner. All 3 of them went down in a tangled mess of limbs, and then it devolved into chaos, a flurry of fists and elbows and desperate grappling. One guard managed to get an arm around Derek's throat, squeezing with all his might, cutting off his air supply. Derek drove his head backward, felt the sickening crunch of a broken nose, and the arm finally loosened its grip. He rolled away, scrambling to his feet in the entrance hall, and the 2 guards did the same. They were hurt. One was holding his face, blood streaming between his fingers, and the other was favoring his left side, where he'd taken a brutal elbow to the ribs. But they were still functional, still dangerous. And Derek was 42 years old, a decade out of practice, fighting two trained men inside the home of a man who could make bodies disappear without a trace. His shoulder was screaming in protest where he'd landed on it wrong. His ribs ached with every breath. Blood dripped from a cut above his eyebrow that he didn't even remember receiving. This wasn't like the training exercises or even the real missions. This was messier, harder, more desperate. The guard with the broken nose pulled a telescoping baton from his belt and extended it with a sharp, menacing snap. "You're dead, old man." Maybe, probably, but Harper's mother was upstairs, barely breathing, and if he went down, she died. That simple, stark equation cut through the pain and the fatigue and the existential horror of what he was becoming. He had to win. Not for glory, not for justice, not even for himself. For a 7-year-old girl who'd run through the pouring rain to beg a stranger for help. The guard with the baton charged, swinging for Derek's head. Derek slipped inside the arc of the swing, too close for the weapon to be effective, and drove his knee with brutal force into the man's groin. Not elegant, not sophisticated, but undeniably effective. The guard folded over in agony, and Derek snatched the baton from his nerveless fingers, spun around, and cracked it across the second guard's reaching arm. Bones snapped with a sickening sound, like green wood breaking. Both men were down now, one curled around his injured groin, the other cradling a shattered forearm. Derek stood over them, chest heaving, the baton feeling heavy and solid in his hand. He could finish this right now, could make absolutely sure they stayed down permanently. It would be safer, tactically sound. Dead men couldn't call for backup, couldn't testify, couldn't come after him later. His hand tightened on the baton. These men had stood by while Vincent beat his wife, had probably even held her down while he did it. They'd earned whatever came next. But that was the old thinking, the operator thinking, the thinking that had led to a family's slaughter in Kandahar because the intelligence had been faulty and Derek hadn't questioned it hard enough. He'd trusted the mission, trusted the certainty of violence, and innocent people had died as a result. He'd sworn that he would never be that person again. Derek released his grip on the baton. It clattered loudly on the marble floor, the sound impossibly deafening in the sudden silence. "Stay down," he said quietly, "or next time I won't stop." He turned his back on them, a risky move, trusting and probably incredibly stupid, and climbed the stairs again. His legs felt like lead, his entire body one massive, throbbing ache. The guard he'd left in the bedroom was gone. He'd probably fled out a back exit. Smart man. Vincent was also gone, and Derek felt a sudden spike of panic before he realized that Rachel was still there, exactly where he'd left her. He gathered her up carefully, mindful of possible spinal injuries, and lifted her gently in his arms. She weighed almost nothing. This powerful CEO, reduced to dead weight and shallow breathing. Blood soaked into his jacket, warm and sickening. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the faint, erratic flutter of her heartbeat against his chest. "Hang on," he whispered. "Your daughter needs you to hang on." The trip down the stairs was a nightmare of agonizing slowness, every step a careful, deliberate negotiation. The two guards were still on the floor where he'd left them, and they watched him pass with hate-filled eyes, but they didn't attempt to move. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Maybe the real 911 call had finally gotten through. Maybe some neighbor had heard the commotion. Either way, help was on its way. Derek made it to his truck and laid Rachel across the back seat as gently as he possibly could. Her breathing had become even more shallow, and her skin was alarmingly cold to the touch. Shock, blood loss, brain injury, any or all of them could kill her before he could get her to a hospital. He climbed into the driver's seat and gunned the engine, pulling away from the curb just as the first police cars turned onto the street behind him. The nearest hospital was 10 minutes away, if he pushed it. Derek drove like he was back in convoy operations, running red lights, taking corners far too fast, one hand gripping the wheel and the other reaching back to keep Rachel from rolling off the seat. She made a sound at one point, a low moan that could have been pain or confusion, and it was the most beautiful sound Derek had ever heard, because it meant she was still in there, still fighting. He pulled up to the emergency room entrance with a screech of brakes and was out of the truck before it had even fully stopped. "I need help." His voice cut through the night air, sharp with command, and two orderlies instantly materialized with a gurney. Domestic violence victim, multiple head traumas, possible internal bleeding. They took over with practiced efficiency, asking questions that he answered on autopilot. No, he wasn't family. Yes, he knew her name, Rachel Sterling. No, he didn't know her medical history. Yes, the police were probably on their way. No, he wasn't the one who hurt her. And then she was gone, wheeled through automatic doors that hissed shut behind her, and Derek was left standing alone in the harsh fluorescent glare of the hospital entrance. His hands were covered in blood, some his, mostly hers. His jacket was ruined beyond repair. His ribs screamed with every breath. The cut above his eyebrow had stopped bleeding, but dried blood now crusted his face. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd just fought his way through a small army to save someone's life. Derek walked back to his truck on legs that barely supported him and slumped into the driver's seat, door open, feet still resting on the pavement. The adrenaline was rapidly draining away now, leaving behind a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion and the beginning of pain that would almost certainly get much worse before it started to get any better. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The muscle tremors were completely beyond his control, likely some combination of extreme exertion, shock, and the lingering psychological aftermath of intense violence. He'd broken his vow, and even worse, a part of him had actually enjoyed breaking it. The stark clarity of combat, the almost seductive simplicity of solving complex problems with brute force. It had felt good, in a way that deeply terrified him. For 10 long years, he'd managed to convince himself that the operator was dead, that he'd successfully buried that dark part of himself. But it had taken less than an hour to prove that that was nothing but a lie. The operator wasn't dead at all, just dormant, patiently waiting for an excuse to wake up. A police car pulled into the parking lot, its lights flashing, but its siren mercifully silent. Derek watched it approach with a sense of detached calm. They'd have questions, of course. He'd have to explain how he'd ended up at Vincent Russo's mansion, why he'd engaged in such extreme violence, and how Rachel had ended up in his truck. The story was complicated, but ultimately defensible. Self-defense, defense of another, good Samaritan laws. He hadn't actually killed anyone, hadn't even caused any permanent, life-altering damage. Probably a good lawyer could make it all just go away. But Derek didn't really care about the potential legal ramifications. He was far more concerned about the 7-year-old girl waiting anxiously at Mrs. Patterson's apartment, desperately hoping to hear that her mother was still alive. He was worried about his own daughter, who'd seen him in crisis mode and would undoubtedly have questions that he didn't even know how to begin to answer. He was deeply troubled by the line he'd crossed, and whether he'd ever be able to find his way back. The officers got out of their car, their hands resting on their weapons, and Derek slowly raised his own hands to show that they were empty. "I'm the one who brought in the domestic violence victim," he called out. "I'm unarmed. I'm cooperative." They approached him cautiously, and Derek allowed them to do so. He let them pat him down, find the knife still tucked securely in his waistband, and confiscate it as evidence. He let them put him in handcuffs, not formally arrested, just detained for questioning. He allowed them to guide him into the back of the cruiser. Throughout the entire process, he kept his face blank, his voice calm and even, answering their questions with only the bare minimum of necessary information. But inside, he was slowly falling apart. Because he'd saved Rachel's life, yes. But he'd also proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the monster he'd tried so desperately to kill was still very much alive, still eager, still ready to emerge the moment that circumstances demanded it. And he didn't know which truth mattered more, that he'd saved someone's life, or that he'd actually enjoyed it. The bright hospital lights blurred past the cruiser window as they drove toward the police station, and Derek closed his eyes tightly. He thought about Chloe, about pancakes and parks, and the simple, peaceful life he'd carefully constructed for them. He thought about Harper, terror etched in her young eyes, begging him for help. He thought about Rachel, broken and bleeding on her expensive carpet. He thought about Vincent, who had probably already lawyered up and was busily constructing a carefully crafted narrative that would inevitably paint Derek as the villain. Most of all, he thought about the next time, because deep down he knew that there would be a next time. There always was a next time. Violence was a door that, once opened, never fully closed again. He knew that from painful experience. The question was whether he could somehow learn to live with that door being slightly ajar, whether he could find a way to be both the loving father who made pancakes and the highly skilled operator who saved lives when no one else could. He didn't have an answer to that question. But as the police station loomed into view and reality closed in around him, Derek knew one thing with absolute certainty. He'd do it all again. He'd break every single vow, cross every forbidden line, and destroy his carefully constructed peace, because the only real alternative was standing by and letting Harper watch her mother die. And that was a weight he absolutely refused to carry. Some sins were undeniably worth committing. Some lines were absolutely worth crossing. That was the hard-won truth that 10 long years in hiding had finally taught him,